Normandy, June 1944. A column of British tanks advances through the hedgerows near Villers-Bocage, confident after days of steady progress following the D-Day landings. The 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, pushes forward, seeking to outflank the German defenders and unhinge their entire defensive line. Within minutes, everything changes. A single German tank emerges from a concealed position along a sunken lane and opens fire. In less than 15 minutes, 12 tanks and 13 half-tracks lie burning along the road. The British advance grinds to a halt, the flanking maneuver collapses, and an entire division's momentum dies in flames and smoke. The weapon responsible is the Tiger, a machine that has haunted Allied tank crews since its first appearance 2 years earlier. But what made this tank so feared? Was it simply superior engineering or something more? A combination of firepower, armor, and psychological impact that turned an armored vehicle into a legend? The answer lies in understanding not just the machine itself, but the desperate circumstances of the war it was built to fight. The story of the Tiger begins not in the factories of wartime Germany, but in the early 1930s, when German military planners first contemplated the role of heavy tanks in modern warfare. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from possessing tanks entirely, but secret development continued throughout the interwar period, and German officers studied armoured warfare theory with intense focus. While the emerging German army initially favoured lighter, faster tanks designed for manoeuvre warfare, the philosophy that would later define the devastating Blitzkrieg campaigns, there were always voices advocating for a different approach. These officers argued for a breakthrough tank, a heavily armoured behemoth capable of absorbing punishment while delivering devastating firepower, able to crack open fortified positions that lighter tanks could not penetrate. The debate between mobility and protection between medium and heavy tanks would shape German armoured development throughout the war. These early discussions remained largely theoretical until Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, an operation that would fundamentally change German tank design forever. In the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, German panzer divisions swept across the Soviet frontier with stunning speed, covering hundreds of kilometers in days and encircling entire Soviet armies. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, workhorses of the German armoured force, seem more than capable of handling Soviet resistance. German tank crews, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans, were confident in their machines and their tactics. The Soviet forces they encountered initially seemed disorganised, poorly led, and easy prey. But as the advance continued deeper into Soviet territory, German tank crews encountered something that shattered their confidence. Soviet tanks that their weapons could barely scratch. The T-34, a medium tank that combined sloped armor with a powerful 76mm gun and wide tracks perfect for the Russian mud, proved nearly invulnerable to standard German anti-tank rounds at combat ranges. The 37mm guns on German anti-tank vehicles earned the contemptuous nickname door knockers for their inability to penetrate Soviet armor. Even the 50mm gun on the upgraded Panzer III struggled against the T-34's cleverly angled plates, which caused shells to ricochet harmlessly away. Even more alarming than the T-34 was the KV-1, a heavy tank whose thick armour shrugged off hit after hit from nearly any German weapon. German tankers reported firing dozens of rounds at KV-1s without effect, watching their shells bounce harmlessly off the Soviet steel while the massive Russian tank continued advancing, seemingly invincible. Reports flooded back to headquarters describing encounters that defied everything German tank crews thought they knew about armoured warfare. In one famous incident near Raseiniai in Lithuania during the opening days of Barbarossa, a single KV-1 held up an entire German division for nearly 2 days. The Soviet tank had positioned itself at a critical crossroads, blocking the advance of the 6th Panzer Division. German tanks engaged it repeatedly without effect. Their shells simply bounced off the KV-1's armour. Anti-tank guns were brought forward and destroyed before they could fire effectively. Artillery was called in, but the heavy Soviet tanks survived the bombardment. The division commander considered calling in the Luftwaffe, but the KV-1's position made air attack difficult. Finally, German engineers crept close under covering fire and destroyed the tank by placing explosive charges directly on its hull. When the dust cleared, German officers counted over a dozen hits on the KV-1's armour, none of which had penetrated. The incident became legendary in the German army, a terrifying, demonstration that Soviet armor could not be dealt with using existing German weapons. These encounters sent shockwaves through the German military establishment. The Panzer III's 50mm gun and the Panzer IV's short-barreled 75 mm were simply inadequate against the new Soviet armor. Something more powerful was needed, and needed urgently, before Soviet tank superiority turned the campaign into a disaster. On 26 May 1941, even before Barbarossa began, Adolf Hitler had already ordered the development of a new heavy tank capable of mounting an 80-mm gun, the powerful anti-aircraft weapon that had proven devastating against tanks in North Africa. The encounters with Soviet armor gave this project sudden, desperate priority. By the end of 1941, two German firms, Henschel and Porsche, were racing to produce prototypes of what would become the most famous tank of the Second World War. The competition between Henschel and Porsche reflected fundamentally different approaches to tank design, and the rivalry between the two companies became one of the most significant engineering contests of the war. Ferdinand Porsche, the automotive genius who had created the Volkswagen Beetle and maintained a personal relationship with Hitler himself, proposed an innovative design using a gasoline-electric hybrid drive system. His tank, designated VK45.01P, would use two air-cooled gasoline engines to generate electricity that powered electric motors at each track, eliminating the need for a conventional mechanical transmission. The concept was technologically ambitious, potentially offering smoother operation, but it was entirely untested in combat vehicles of this size and weight. Henschel, under Chief Engineer Erwin Adders, took a more conservative approach, building on proven German tank technology developed through years of practical experience. Their design, designated VK45-1H, used conventional mechanical transmission and a suspension system derived from earlier German heavy tank projects. Adders and his team prioritized reliability and manufacturability, aware that even the finest tank design was worthless if it could not be produced in quantity or kept running in the field. The Henschel approach was less glamorous than Porsche's innovative hybrid system, but it represented engineering grounded in practical realities. On 20 April 1942, Adolf Hitler's 53rd birthday, both prototypes were demonstrated at Rastenburg in East Prussia, near the Wolfslair headquarters, where Hitler directed the war. The Führer inspected each vehicle personally, climbing onto the massive hulls and examining the interiors. While Porsche's design enjoyed Hitler's personal interest, its complex electric drive system proved problematic in testing. The gasoline-electric system was prone to overheating, and mechanical failures occurred with disturbing frequency. The system also required large quantities of copper for its electrical components, a strategic material in critically short supply in wartime Germany. Henschel's more conventional design proved significantly more reliable in testing and considerably easier to produce, using existing German industrial capabilities. The evaluation board recommended the Henschel prototype for production. The German army designated it Panzerkampfwagen 6, Tiger Ausführung I, or simply the Tiger. Ferdinand Porsche's design was not entirely abandoned. The 90 hulls already under construction were later converted into the Ferdinand tank destroyer, which would see action at Kursk. What emerged from this development process was unlike any tank the world had seen. A machine designed from the ground up to dominate any battlefield encounter through overwhelming firepower and near impenetrable protection. The Tiger weighed approximately 57 metric tons fully loaded, more than twice the weight of the Panzer IV it was meant to supplement, and nearly 3 times heavier than the American M4 Sherman that would become its primary opponent in Western Europe. This enormous mass was not accidental. It was the necessary price of the Tiger's defining characteristics. The Tiger's armor represented a dramatic leap in protection, surpassing anything the Allies could field. The frontal hull plate measured 100 mm thick, while the turret front reached 120 mm in places, thicknesses that rendered the tank essentially immune to most Allied weapons at combat ranges. Unlike the Soviet T-34, which achieved protection through cleverly sloped armor that caused shells to ricochete, the Tiger relied primarily on sheer thickness. Its armor plates were largely flat and vertical, a design choice that critics sometimes point to as mechanically inefficient. But the metal itself was of exceptional quality, carefully manufactured, face-hardened steel that resisted penetration with remarkable effectiveness. German metallurgical expertise produced armor plate that often exceeded its nominal specifications. The sides and rear of the Tiger, while thinner at 60 to 80 millimeters, still exceeded the frontal armor of most Allied tanks. A Tiger crew could engage enemies from multiple directions with reasonable confidence that even flanking shots might be absorbed. For Allied tank crews accustomed to their own vehicle's vulnerable armor, facing a Tiger from any angle meant confronting protection they could scarcely imagine. British Churchill tanks, considered heavily armoured by Allied standards, carried frontal armour of only 102 millimeters, comparable to the Tiger's sides. But armour alone did not make the Tiger feared. Defensive strength was only half the equation. The Tiger's true terror came from what sat in its turret, the 80A Patoutem to a K36 L56 gun, a weapon that combined accuracy, range and penetrating power in a combination that no Allied tank gun could match. This weapon traced its lineage to the famous 8-point Infall Panzers flak gun, an anti-aircraft weapon that German commanders had discovered could destroy tanks, with devastating effectiveness during the North African campaign. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel became famous for deploying 80mm guns in ambush positions, destroying British armoured attacks before they could close to effective range. The caliber K36 was adapted specifically for tank use, featuring a longer barrel optimized for anti-tank work and an improved breech mechanism that allowed faster loading. The results were extraordinary by any standard. The 80mm gun could penetrate 120mm of armor 1,000 meters, using standard Panzergranate 39 ammunition, enough to destroy any Allied tank of the period at ranges where return fire posed little threat to the Tiger itself. With tungsten core Panzergranate 40 ammunition, penetration increased to over 170 millimeters at the same range, though chronic shortages of tungsten throughout the war meant these devastating rounds were used sparingly, reserved for the most dangerous targets. The practical implications of this firepower advantage were stark, defining every encounter between Tigers and Allied armor. A Tiger could engage and destroy an M4 Sherman at 2,000 meters or beyond, well over a mile away, while the Sherman's standard 70mm gun could only penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at ranges under 100 meters, essentially requiring point-blank fire that almost never occurred in actual combat. British tankers faced similar disadvantages. The Churchill's 6-pounder gun and the Cromwell's 75mm both struggled against Tiger armor at any realistic combat distance. The Tiger could engage entire formations of Allied tanks, picking them off one by one before any return fire could threaten its crew. This asymmetry created a psychological dimension that transcended mere technical specifications, affecting Allied morale in ways that statistics alone could not capture. Tank crews across the Allied forces knew that engaging a Tiger meant entering a fight they were statistically likely to lose. The knowledge that a distant shape on the horizon, perhaps barely visible to the naked eye, could destroy them before they came close enough to fight back bred a fear that official reports sometimes struggled to express adequately. Tank warfare, which had once seemed like a contest of skill and courage between roughly equal opponents, became something grimmer when Tigers were involved, a lottery where the odds heavily favoured the German side. The Tiger entered combat for the first time on 29 August 1942, near Leningrad on the Eastern Front, in an operation that would reveal both the tank's potential and its limitations. The debut was inauspicious, far from the triumphant introduction that German propaganda would later portray. Operating in swampy terrain near the village of Mga, the initial Tigers of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion suffered mechanical breakdowns that immobilized several vehicles before they could engage the enemy. The boggy ground, crossed by numerous streams and dotted with marshes, proved treacherous. For the 57-ton behemoths, where lighter tanks might struggle through, Tigers sank helplessly into the mud. German recovery crews, lacking equipment capable of moving disabled Tigers in such terrain, were forced to destroy the immobilized vehicles to prevent Soviet capture. Despite these efforts, the Soviets eventually recovered at least one Tiger for study, shipping it back to research facilities where engineers disassembled it methodically. The initial deployment revealed what would become a persistent theme throughout the Tiger's operational history. The Tiger was a formidable weapon, perhaps the most formidable tank in the world, but it was also a maintenance nightmare that demanded conditions the battlefield often refused to provide. The Tiger's mechanical complexity reflected its engineering ambition, but created endless problems for crews and maintenance personnel. The interleaved road wheel suspension system, in which the wheels overlapped each other in a complex arrangement, provided excellent weight distribution and a remarkably smooth ride for such a heavy vehicle. But the system was a maintenance nightmare under field conditions. Mud, snow, and debris could pack into the spaces between the overlapping wheels, and in the bitter cold of the Russian winter, this material would freeze solid overnight, literally locking the wheels in place. Tiger crews learned to dread cold nights, knowing they might spend hours the next morning chipping ice from their suspension before the tank could move. The final drive and transmission, subjected to enormous stress by the tank's weight and the demands of steering such a massive vehicle, were prone to failure that no amount of maintenance could entirely prevent. German logistics struggled constantly to keep Tigers supplied with the spare parts, specialized tools, and trained mechanics they required. The Tiger's powerful Maybach engine, while providing adequate power for the tank's weight, consumed fuel at a prodigious rate and required regular maintenance that was difficult to perform under combat conditions. Recovery of disabled Tigers required specialized equipment. Standard German tank recovery vehicles were simply incapable of towing a 57-ton behemoth, and this equipment was often unavailable when needed. But the Tiger's baptism in North Africa, which followed in December 1942, told a very different story from the muddy disappointment at Leningrad. Elements of the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion arrived in Tunisia to support German and Italian forces defending against the Allied advance following Operation Torch. The desert terrain presented none of the mobility challenges that had plagued the Tigers in Russia. On the firm, flat ground of Tunisia, the Tiger's weight posed few problems, and its gun could exploit the long sight lines that characterized North African warfare. On 1 December 1942, near the town of Tiburba, Tigers engaged Allied armor for the first time in conditions that favored their capabilities. American M3 Lee tanks and British Crusaders, advancing across open ground toward German positions, encountered Tigers at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The results were devastating. Allied tanks were destroyed methodically before they could close to effective range, their crews dying without ever having a chance to fight back on equal terms. Survivors reported watching shells strike the Tigers without apparent effect, the massive German tanks continuing to fire as if invulnerable. Word spread quickly among British and American forces operating in Tunisia. The Germans had deployed a new weapon, and nothing in the Allied arsenal could stop it. Tank crews who survived encounters with Tigers brought back stories that seemed almost unbelievable, of shells bouncing harmlessly off enemy armor, of tanks destroyed from distances that seemed impossible, of a German weapon that appeared to render Allied armor obsolete overnight. The psychological impact of these early encounters would persist long after the Allies developed countermeasures, shaping how an entire generation of soldiers thought about armored warfare. Throughout 1943, the Tiger's reputation grew on both the Eastern and Western fronts, each engagement adding to the legend. On the Eastern Front, Tiger battalions became elite units, assigned to critical sectors where their firepower could make the greatest impact on battles that might otherwise tip against German forces. These heavy tank battalions were not distributed among regular divisions but held as strategic reserves, deployed to crisis points where their concentrated firepower could stabilize collapsing fronts or spearhead critical attacks. The German summer offensive at Kursk in July 1943, history's largest tank battle and one of the most decisive engagements of the war, showcased both the Tiger's power and its limitations. Tigers formed the spearhead of several German attack formations tasked with breaking through Soviet defensive lines that had been prepared for months. In the northern sector, Tigers of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion participated in the assault around Ponary. In the south, Tigers of the elite Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division led attacks toward Prokhorovka. The individual performance of Tiger units at Kursk was often extraordinary, with some vehicles destroying dozens of Soviet tanks while sustaining minimal losses themselves. German crews reported engagements where they faced waves of T-34s and destroyed them systematically, the Soviet tanks unable to penetrate Tiger armor at the ranges where the 80mm gun remained deadly accurate. But the offensive ultimately failed despite these tactical successes, ground down by Soviet defenses in depth, massive minefields, and the sheer attrition of constant combat. The Tigers proved they could destroy enemy tanks with impressive efficiency. They could not by themselves win the battle. Soviet tankers learned through bitter experience to avoid engaging Tigers frontally, a lesson purchased with thousands of destroyed T-34s and their crews. Instead, Soviet tactics evolved to emphasize flanking maneuvers that might expose the Tiger's thinner side armor, coordinated attacks that overwhelmed individual Tigers with numbers, and the use of terrain to close the range before the Tiger's gun advantage could prove decisive. Soviet commanders accepted that destroying a Tiger would cost them multiple tanks and deliberately planned their operations around this exchange ratio. In North Africa and later in Italy, the Tiger continued to dominate individual engagements. During the fighting at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Tigers helped shatter the American Tankoon Corps. Tigers destroyed numerous M3 and M4 tanks in running battles across the Tunisian highlands, and American infantry reported watching helplessly as Tigers advanced through their positions, seemingly impervious to everything thrown at them. One after-action report described a Tiger taking multiple direct hits from a 57mm anti-tank gun without apparent effect. Such accounts created the Tiger's fearsome mystique, a reputation that influenced tactical decisions long after commanders should have known better. The Tiger's psychological impact cannot be separated from its tactical reality because the two reinforced each other. Allied intelligence reports documented what they termed Tiger fever or Tigerphobia, a tendency among frontline troops to report Tigers in situations where none were actually present. Every German tank became a potential Tiger. Every engagement carried the threat of confronting the seemingly invincible enemy. Panzer IVs and Stu-G assault guns were misidentified as Tigers with remarkable frequency. British General Brian Horrocks, an experienced armoured commander, noted that his tank crews would sometimes hesitate or even refuse to advance when Tigers were rumoured to be in the area. American tank destroyer doctrine, which emphasized mobility and ambush tactics rather than direct armored confrontation, developed partly in response to the recognition that American tanks could not engage Tigers in stand-up fights and survive. The psychological dimension amplified the Tiger's tactical effectiveness, causing delays and disruptions even when no Tigers were actually present. Among the Tiger's crews, certain individuals achieved legendary status. The most famous was SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, who commanded Tigers in the 1st SS Panzer Division and later in the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. Wittmann's most celebrated action occurred on 13 June 1944 at Villers-Bocage. The British 7th Armoured Division had identified a gap in German lines and was attempting a flanking movement that could unravel the entire German defensive position in Normandy. Wittmann, commanding a company of Tigers, recognized the danger and attacked immediately, despite being outnumbered. In a brief, devastating engagement, Wittmann destroyed numerous vehicles, throwing the entire British advance into disarray. German propaganda celebrated Wittmann as a hero, and his total claims eventually exceeded 130 tanks and 132 anti-tank guns destroyed. Wittmann was killed on 8 August 1944 during Operation Totalize near Sintho in Normandy, his Tiger destroyed, probably by a Sherman Firefly's 17-pounder. His grave was not identified until 1983. Oberleutnant Otto Karius fought primarily on the Eastern Front, commanding Tigers around Narva in Estonia during 1944. His reported tally exceeded 150 vehicles. His post-war memoir, Tigers in the Mud, provides one of the most detailed and honest accounts of Tiger combat available. Unlike propaganda accounts portraying the Tiger as invincible, Karius described both the vehicle's tremendous strengths and its frustrating mechanical unreliability. He emphasized that the Tiger's reputation depended not just on the machine but on well-trained crews who understood its capabilities and limitations intimately. The Tiger's dominance inevitably prompted Allied responses. Infantry anti-tank teams attempted to disable Tigers at close range using weapons like the American bazooka and British Piat, targeting tracks, rear engine deck, and other vulnerable components. These attacks were dangerous. Approaching a Tiger closely enough often meant death, but they offered the only realistic chance for infantry to stop a Tiger advance. Tank units practiced coordinated attacks where multiple vehicles engaged a single Tiger simultaneously from different directions. Artillery and air support were called against suspected Tiger positions whenever possible. Technical solutions took longer to develop. The British upgun selected Sherman tanks with the powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun, creating the Sherman Firefly. The 17-pounder could penetrate Tiger frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, finally giving Allied tank crews a weapon that could fight back on equal terms. Fireflies were distributed throughout British armored units, typically one per troop of 4 tanks, serving as designated Tiger killers. German tankers learned to identify and target Fireflies first by their longer barrels. The Americans developed the M26 Pershing heavy tank with a 19 gun, capable of engaging Tigers at realistic combat ranges. However, the Pershing arrived too late for extensive combat in Europe. More commonly, American forces relied on the M36 Jackson tank destroyer, mounting the same 90mm gun on a lighter chassis. American tank destroyer doctrine emphasized mobility and concealment rather than direct confrontation. The Soviets developed the Su-152, mounting a massive 150mm howitzer that could destroy any German tank through sheer explosive force. Soviet tankers nicknamed it Zveroboy, Beast Killer. The T-34-85 featured 85mm guns capable of penetrating Tiger side armor at moderate ranges. The IS-2 heavy tank, mounting a 122mm gun, could engage Tigers frontally, though it's slow. Rate of fire posed challenges. Despite its reputation, the Tiger suffered significant limitations that constrained its strategic value. Mechanical unreliability plagued Tiger units throughout the war. The interleaved suspension was vulnerable to mud, ice, and combat damage. Final drives failed regularly. Tiger units routinely lost vehicles to breakdown during road marches before reaching combat. At 57 tons, the Tiger exceeded most bridge capacities, forcing units to seek alternative crossings. Fuel consumption, roughly 540 litres per 100 kilometres on roads, strained Germany's chronic shortages. Moving Tigers required careful planning and substantial logistical support. Production numbers further constrained the Tiger's impact. Approximately 1,147 Tigers were manufactured between 1942 and 1944. Impressive given complexity, but minimal compared to Allied production. The Soviet Union produced over 50,000 T-34s. The United States built roughly 49,000 Shermans. The Tiger was an exclusive weapon available only for special operations. Allied forces could lose tanks by hundreds, knowing replacements were arriving continuously. Germany could not replace Tigers at the rate they were lost. The mathematics of industrial warfare favored the Allies, and no individual vehicle superiority could overcome that. Germany's response was building something larger, the Tiger II, or King Tiger. Weighing nearly 70 tons, it mounted the devastating 80mm L-71 gun, with sloped armor reaching 185mm. On paper, the war's most powerful tank. But the King Tiger magnified all problems. Its weight collapsed bridges, made transport nearly impossible, and mechanical breakdowns were frequent. Fuel consumption was astronomical. Only 492 were built. King Tigers often became immobile fortresses, defending positions until ammunition or fuel ran out. The Tiger was a tactical masterpiece, but arguably a strategic liability, consuming resources that might have produced several Panzerfalls. For every Tiger built, German industry faced an impossible choice: small numbers of superior vehicles that could not be everywhere, or larger numbers of adequate vehicles that could be replaced. The mathematics favored the Allies, and no individual vehicle superiority could overcome that disadvantage. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied intelligence teams examined captured Tigers carefully. Engineers were impressed by German optics, manufacturing precision, and armament power. They were less impressed by complexity, maintenance requirements, and disregard for mass production demands. Soviet engineers studied Tigers intensively, incorporating lessons into post-war designs, including the IS-3. Today, remarkably few Tigers survive, perhaps 7 worldwide. The most famous is Tiger 131, captured in Tunisia in April 1943 after a shell jammed its turret. Restored to running condition at the Tank Museum at Bovington, it is the only operational Tiger in the world, its engine roaring too. Life at special events. Other survivors rest in museums from Samoa to Kubinka, silent monuments to a weapon that shaped both military history and popular imagination. Why was the Tiger the most feared tank of World War II? It was feared because its armor could stop almost anything the Allies could fire at it, feared because tank crews knew their weapons were inadequate. It was feared because its gun could destroy Allied tanks at ranges where they could not fight back, feared because the calculus of engagement meant attacking a Tiger often meant certain death. But it was also feared for what it represented: the terrifying possibility that German technology might offset Allied numerical superiority. That quality might triumph over quantity. That fear proved unfounded. The The war was won not by the best tank but by the most tanks, produced by industries beyond German reach. The Tiger stands as a reminder of warfare valuing the exceptional over the reproducible, the powerful over the practical, the feared over the merely effective. In the end, it was not enough. But for those who faced it, who watched comrades die beneath its gun, the Tiger remains what it always was, the most dangerous thing on the battlefield, a 57-ton embodiment of fear itself, silent now in museums but never entirely forgotten. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to German tanks after WW2. Next, a deep look at how Germany's armoured fleet was captured, studied and scattered across the world in the aftermath of the war. Like this video, subscribe and hit the bell for more history. Thanks for watching.